Okay. Are we good? Yeah, okay. All right, it is October 15th, 2024. This is our 5 o'clock Board of Education study session. We're going to begin by indicating who is here. Kim, why don't you start?
Kim Chandler.
Julie Jackson.
Chris Wynn.
Karen Winder. Hello, Karen Winder.
Clark Nelson.
Connie, go ahead.
Connie Burgess.
Todd Hubbard.
Ben Worsley.
And Nicole McDermott. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started on our deselection process for books. This was something that we brought forth during this time because as law and policy, as we've reviewed this and reviewed this and reviewed this to make sure we've got this hopefully right, a good process with this, and that we are in compliance with the state law. There were some things that came up, and we want to make sure that you have if you have questions that you're able to ask, because we are also going to ask you to help with some committees. So we're going to turn the time over to be the one that's doing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've asked Joe to be here tonight, and I've also asked Chris to be here. Noelle is out of town and unable to make it. She wanted to be here as well, but I think the three of us can hopefully take care of it. Our presentation is titled Updating a Review Process from HB 374 to HB 29. So again, this is a moving target and it has been for some time, as you're well aware. And what we have done is try to create a framework that includes all the requirements of the law and also provides some flexibility with respect to each of the areas of both selection and deselection of materials. And I'll get into that in a little more detail. You guys go ahead and jump in at any time. If I need some additional help, I'll ask you. This won't advance. Any ideas?
Down arrow.
Down arrow. There we go. Okay. So our first, the policy that we created, that we have talked about, that went through our policy committee and that the board voted on, is Article 8 or 10A6. Okay, that policy is essentially the commentary that describes this model that we've created. This model shows that our overarching umbrella for all materials that are used in schools in any way are what we call learning materials. And this, this model just shows you how we've broken it down into categories so that we can manage and govern each of those categories independently, with the keeping in mind that they all have separate statutes that require some compliance in different ways. So to break it down, we have divided up our learning materials into novels, our library materials, our instructional materials, supplemental materials, our sex ed materials, our health materials, and our maturation materials. And then a final category, which is our concurrent enrollment, AP, and IB materials, okay? Each of those categories, you can see there, are governed by separate policies and state statutes and rules. We've listed those there. They all do fall under 10A6. However, each of them has a separate memo that governs the processes for selection and deselection of those materials. So let me go through each of those just real quickly. 57, again, Memo 57 is what governs library materials. Memo 94 is what governs novels. Memo 140 governs instructional and supplemental materials, and Memo 127 and 128 govern our maturation and our health curriculum. The next section addresses the the committee or the individuals that would be involved in the deselection process if there were complaints or concerns about sensitive materials. So we have a novels committee, educational tech, selection and deselection. Thank you, Chris. Selection of these materials. We'll talk about deselection in just a second. So selection, novels committee, educational technology committee, RFP committee. Teachers select their own supplemental materials. Sex ed is selected by the sex ed committee. And concurrent enrollment, ABIP, those are selected by the authorizing entity, whether that's the college board or what have you. And then the next one down is essentially our review process, or the deselection of these materials, if indeed they they violate they violate state code for sensitive materials. And what you can see here are essentially the individuals that would be involved in that process, and the state rule that governs that process is R277628. So that's the framework. That's how we've developed a framework around our policies and procedures. We feel like this is a comprehensive and yet simple way to be able to organize it so that we're not conflating procedures between those categories of materials. But as you can see, the review process for novels, library, instructional, supplemental materials for sensitive, in terms of sensitive materials, will all be the same. Sex ed and concurrent enrollment ABIP, those are exempted from the sensitive materials review. And if we're going to have reviews for those, we will do them on an ad hoc basis at the direction of the board and superintendent. Did I forget anything on those? Okay, awesome. So that last section there, the review section, I'm going to kind of take that section now and blow that up a little bit, okay? That review section in practical terms will look like this flow chart. Now, we created our own flow chart, and I can't remember who in policy, law and policy liked our flow chart better, but we kind of liked our flow chart, but the state came up with a flow chart that I think is helpful because it standardizes the state's their direction and their counsel on this process. So that's the process that the individuals would go through in order to review materials that have been challenged or someone has made allegations that they contain sensitive materials. Okay, I'll just run through it really quickly. Step one of that is the initial review. This is what's called a plausible review, or a review for a plausible claim. The way we handle this, at least two district officials have got to do a plausibility review. The superintendent has appointed me and Mitch to do that plausibility review. Really, the only thing that plausibility review is supposed to do is determine whether a plausible claim has been made and whether the book is going to remain on the shelves while it goes through the process, okay?
I just wanted to thank the two of them for volunteering for this incredibly important work.
I volunteered as quickly as I could to be on that committee. The objective sensitive materials review is the next step, and basically the objective review process is trying to determine objectively whether a question material contains content that would violate three subsections of 53G10-1227, okay, which is, and you can see the three sections of that particular code listed there. We will have at least three parents reviewing those, the summaries of those, of the materials, where the offensive materials have been, or excuse me, the excerpts is the word I'm looking for. Thank you. Excerpts of those materials have been taken out and put into a table for an easy review. okay? We actually ask parents or whoever's making a complaint to provide to us the excerpts that they object to, but we also have easy access to others who have done the work and have pulled out those excerpts so that we can review them quite easily. So the Objective Review Committee would go through those and determine whether there is any content in there that meets one or more of those three criteria. If there is content that meets one or more of those three criteria, as you can see, the material will remain inaccessible to students, meaning that the material is pulled and is pulled indefinitely for good. Okay? If that review committee determines that it doesn't, that the the excerpts do not necessarily meet the standards of an objective sensitive review, then we will have what we call a subjective sensitive review. And you'll recall when we talked about this, this process before, we referred to this as basically the Miller test. This is a balancing test, a factor balancing test. We need parents to be part of this committee as well. And as an aside, students can have access to the material with parental consent while this process is taking place. But what the committee members will review in this particular circumstance is the whole material. So if there's a book, they will read the whole novel or the whole book, okay? And the idea is that they will be using community standards to analyze that material, to determine whether there is pornographic or indecent material that is contained therein. Now, again, this is a factor balancing test. So to determine whether there's something pornographic or indecent in those materials, the community members, our parents, will determine, or excuse me, they'll analyze these based on the work as a whole. They'll determine whether there's content that appeals to the purient interest of sex and minors, whether there's patently offensive material that's based on those community standards and taken as a whole, whether there's any remaining serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So they're essentially balancing these factors to determine whether there is still value in maintaining the book or whether there's not. That's the subjective review. And if the material is found to be subjectively objectionable, then the material will be removed. If it is not, then it will be returned. If there is an appeal, that appeal will come directly to you as board members. Now, who can appeal? Students can appeal, parents can appeal, employees can appeal, and relevant board members can appeal. That's what it says in the statute. And at that point, the appeal would come directly to you, and you would be able to weigh in and make a determination as to whether the material stays or goes. So that is our process. Step 5 is that if we do find something that's objectively or subjectively offensive or that offends the statutes, then we report that to USBE. USBE maintains a database. If there are 3 or more districts that have the same book that they've identified as having sensitive material, the book will be removed statewide. Or if there's if there are 2 districts and 5 charter schools, then the book will be removed statewide. Okay, gentlemen, what did I forget in that process? Did we get it? Okay.
The construction of the review groups later.
Yeah. Are there any questions that you have on the review process before we move? The next thing we're going to talk about is the training of the individuals. Joe sent you a letter a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, requesting that we kind of shore up our parent volunteers. Chris has been working with our parent volunteers in the past. He essentially developed the whole back end process of helping those individuals make the appropriate reviews. And now he's handing that task off to Joe. And hopefully Chris can get some additional work done now that he's handing that off to Joe. He's done a lot of work in the background, by the way. I want to acknowledge that. But are there any other questions before we get going? Yeah, Chris.
So I just have a question on the appeal part. If it's appealed in our district, and let's say we say we're going to take this off our shelves, we report that to USBA. If there's USBE, sorry, and if there's no other schools that do that, it's only our district that has to remove that, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So if other districts do this, we can't appeal if another district finds a book, and one that we maybe said, we're okay with this on our shelves, maybe in the high school section or whatever.
Right.
But if another district says, no, we don't want it, we have three districts.
There's three
We have to
districts.
pull it no matter what. There's no
That's
appeal
correct.
process for us after that.
That's correct. That would
Okay.
trump our process.
Okay.
Good question.
Doug, is there anything on this flow chart that is not the law, that is something that we ourselves have decided to do?
You mean, are there things that we have decided to do that are not on this flow chart?
No, I mean,
I'll give you one example. Are you talking about parent committees, for example?
not necessarily. I think what I want to know is, I feel like most of this, I do not support the law that was passed. But I feel that I'm going to need to vote in support of whatever policy we put together.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
So I want to make sure that I understand what are the things that I, as a board member, have say over. Does that make sense? That is not the law.
Yeah, let me point one thing out. So the membership of the objective and the subjective sensitive materials review committees doesn't need to be only parents. In the law, it has to have a majority of parents on that committee. We have made a determination that the easiest thing is just to keep going with the committees that we've already started to develop, that this gives community input kind of to the nth degree, and we'd like our parents to be involved in this way. So that's one area where we've maybe gone above and beyond the statute requirement, but we feel like it's actually a more appropriate way to approach it because of the requirement that community standards must be reflected.
Okay.
And is there anything else that
Anything
you can
else?
think of, Chris, that is in our process that isn't reflected here?
Well, and I guess ultimately, this flow chart is put together by USBE,
Correct.
not by us. So, so the flow chart itself is basically an interpretation of the law. And then we've said, okay, and how we're going to do this flow chart is with these committees, and this is how we're going to make them up. And
Right.
I see it, okay.
And again, I think the reason for using the flow chart that was created by USBE is that standardizes the process across the state.
I really support that idea. And I wanted to just also say, can you go to one slide back? I just want to point out that per this slide, this review process only happens with novels, library, instructional, and supplemental materials. Sex ed, if somebody was, wanted to review sex ed, it goes to sex ed committee. And concurrent IB and AP, that would go to SLIC or
Right,
IB
SLIC
or
or the
AP
College Board
if you
or-
didn't like what was happening there.
That's correct.
I would just like to make a quick comment, if I might. We really love this review committee process, and I know it's challenging for sometimes you to find volunteers to read some of these materials, but the fact is we have a diverse community, and we cover 355 square miles, and there are different values and community standards within the community that Granite serves. And so this provides an abundance of protection to determine what the appropriate community standard is in each of these areas. And that's not going to be up for a district administrator to determine. We don't live in these communities oftentimes. Sometimes we do. But I really love this protection and this process. So we hope you will continue to humor us in terms of providing volunteers, and we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Or support us,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, related to that comment, Ben, I have one of these committee members has approached me and asked the question, I think it's a very astute question, as to whether under state law, there could be a scenario by which a committee member could find a publication to be objectionable or needing to be removed, but they can objectively also see it as fulfilling a need that may exist for some student in some situation. Is there a mechanism by which such publications could be removed from shelves, but then if parental permission were provided, it could be offered to a student or provided to a student if they requested it? Is that something that can be accomplished under state law that we're facing,
Yeah.
or not?
The answer is no. Because you put us into that equation, us meaning the school district, us meaning government actors working for the school district, the answer is no. So we would have to, the parents would have to be directed to obtain that material elsewhere.
Thank you.
I did have a quick question. Sorry, I didn't see this earlier. Just on the initial review, is part of that you look also to see, because I know we've had people just get lists of books and submit them. As part of that initial review, do you go and actually look and see if we have them in our library, I'm assuming, or do you just go for them? I assume you do, but I
Yeah, please
didn't
do.
know if that was part of that.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so I historically have received those reviews, and that will turn over to Joe, but we first do a check within Destiny, which is our system, to see which schools that book is in, because we've had to direct those librarians to remove the book while it's under review, while it's under that objective sensitive materials review, we remove those from the shelves. So we do check that. A nuance to that is we were directed by USBE to Chris's prior question about books that USBE had met their threshold and needed to be pulled statewide. We have included those on our list so that we avoid purchasing them. There were 3 or 4 of them that we don't have, but we saw them listed on our sheet so that we avoid purchasing a book that has been directed by USBE for us to pull. So there are some nuances there, but yes, part of the check is, do we have this book, where do we have it, and communicating with those school level personnel to make sure that we take appropriate action.
I assumed you did, but I just thought it's silly to have our parents go through this whole process to find that we don't even have the book, so.
For sure. We've had a few that were submitted through some of those lists that were passed around through different channels, and our response to the complainant was, we don't have that book in any of our schools. So we do check that first. You'll notice on our public-facing sheet that is provided, we list which locations each of the books was cataloged or before it was pulled, because currently any book that's under review is pulled from the shelves.
Okay, thank you.
One more clarification. So if a book goes through the subjective sensitive materials review, we have a yes or no option here in the flow chart, but it could be high school only, could be the answer. Is that correct?
So for objective, it's an all or nothing. Your question is related to subjective. So let's say hypothetically, what you're saying is all of those three questions were no in 2, the objective review. So in a subjective review, yes, the outcome could be that it is restricted, is what they refer to. So restricted to a certain age group, because there you're taking community standard, literary value, scientific value for a particular content area.
Okay.
So that's where there would be an option to restrict it to an age group, versus objective is all or nothing. It's either pulled or retained.
And the committee doesn't necessarily have any sort of rubric for what should be high school, junior high, elementary. They kind of get together and use their judgment. Is that fair to say?
They use community standard in our training slides that we'll provide to them. We try to give some examples of what community standard looks like. The state law speaks to that somewhat. The prior state law talks about prurient interest in sex and minors. Basically, if you think of it as subjective parallels our existing process before changing it July 1, is a little bit more of that subjective review where you're reading the whole work, you're looking at its community standard, its literary value, and you may or may not keep it.
So there is sort of some training around what that could look like.
Yeah,
for-
that's a good segue. I just want to thank board members once again for being willing to help us to find volunteers for this work. It's important work. We think that it will slow down over time after after these initial first waves of books have been sorted out. But I'm going to turn the time over to Joe. He and I will be doing some trainings, but I want him to kind of talk a little bit more about the committees themselves and how those will function after you've had an opportunity to provide names of volunteers. Go ahead, Joe.
Doug, real quick. Kim looks like she has a question.
Oh, sorry, Kim.
I have 3 questions. This first one you might answer when you take over, Joe, but you mentioned that the Objective Review Committee, we're going to have 3 parents. Did I hear that right?
How many? No, I'm sorry. We're asking each of you to come up with
Okay.
3 volunteers.
Just
Yeah.
clarifying that, because that wasn't what I thought we talked about.
The state law requires a minimum of 3.
Yeah.
We're doing minimum of 1 per precinct.
Okay. Also on that chart, we're exempting AP. I thought that we had discussed that AP was not exempt by HB 29 in our law and policy meetings.
So there is still some question surrounding that. We have not received specific guidance from USBE yet. I have requested that guidance. So in 1235, it specifically states that AP, IB, and concurrent are exempted from the definition of a sensitive material. And so the others, what is it? It's 53G10-103 only lists concurrent, but the other statute does list all 3 of those things as being exempt from sensitive materials review. I've asked for that, for clarification on that. We haven't received it yet, but if we do get clarification from USB, we'll modify our policy and change that.
And then the third question is, I've heard that our app that we use to allow students to read books electronically, library materials, the Sora app, links them directly to public libraries as well. So through our app, they can access all these same books through their public library. Has that been investigated and addressed?
I don't know about that. I can't speak to it, but Chris probably
I can speak to that, Doug. Without spending too much of your time, within Sora, you add different libraries. So a Granite student will sign in and add the Granite library. Our county libraries have made access for students where they can add a county library. However, because of these laws, they've filtered them by age group, so they don't have access to everything that's in the public library. They have access to, they've worked directly with Davina Southoff, who is the USBE kind of liaison for library media materials. So what they have access to is an educational library that is separate from the full access to the public library. But you are correct that there is access to public library materials through the Sora app.
Would they have to sign up for and have their own library card at those libraries?
They don't have to sign up separately for a card, but they do have to proactively go and add those books to their account.
Okay.
So let's say that I go into my public library through my Sora app, which I believe would be through my student ID, right? I have access to only an educational material.
An age-restricted list, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
Yeah, they pulled a whole collection from their collection when HB 29 was passed. They added additional restrictions to their settings.
So you're saying anything that's been pulled statewide or from our district, they should also be restricting?
They should be, yes. Anything that USB has deemed to be pulled, yes.
But if I log in through an account that I just made with the public library system, then I have access to the whole library, is that correct?
Likely not. Sora is a paid product, so it would have to be paid through some sort of partnership. So there's not a way to just sign into Sora through the public library and have access to, there would be through
I
a,
don't mean going through Sora, I just mean if I just have my library card and I just get on.
so completely separate.
Separate
Oh.
So,
It's completely
Yeah.
separate from us.
yeah, so the
Okay.
public library, yes, you could create an account. They often have partnerships with Overdrive or other companies to where you can get certain titles in ebook or other forms, but that's disconnected from our district
Yeah,
library.
okay.
Okay, so go ahead, Joe, I'll let you talk about the committees.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for reaching out in your communities. If you did not get an email from me listing last year's volunteers, reach out to me, but I did send one to each board member. Our committees are going to be broken up, as we said, into the two groups, objective and subjective committees. And in the most simplest terms, the objective committee will be excerpts and will be more frequent reviews, but less total pages. And the subjective committee is going to be whole books. So parents can be on either or both. I suspect a lot of these parents will want to be on both, but if they want to be on just one, that's fine, whether because they're interested more in reading whole novels or, you know, maybe they don't want to just be subjected to the objective excerpts all the time. That would be understandable as well. I will be handling these groups on a confidential basis, and it's small enough that I will be contacting each parent individually. I won't be sending out any group emails. I will be available at all times. If they want to just contact me directly, they'll have my number, contact info. I can work through individual questions with them. If they have questions about material or the law, I can do that on an individual basis. We'll also be training. I'll send out the training materials and we'll review those collectively. So look for that materials to come out once we feel like we've assembled our membership groups, our volunteers. As I said, we do need more volunteers. We don't have the numbers yet, so hopefully you get a good community response. As we said, the reason we're doing this and putting in all this work is so that we get a representative group from, like the superintendent said, from all these different communities that are represented in the district. Training will be done, this will all be done remotely, hopefully during work hours, I think for the most part, but I would be available, in the evenings if it turns out most of these people, are available after work hours for the most part.
We'll accommodate them.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want this to be burdensome or onerous on these volunteers. We appreciate their time and we'll be respectful of that, but we also know that this is an important job that they're doing, and we want to do it right. Any questions about the parent committees?
I'm just sorry I haven't responded to the email. I was out of town, but are you looking for how many from each board member? Because it says on here they need 3, but you're not asking for us to come up with 3 names, or are you? Do you want us to come up with 3?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, ideally. Now, I guess it would depend. If you had people that were only interested in one committee, that number could be different. If you only had 3 people that each only wanted to do one committee, it might be possible we'd want
A few
enough
more?
that we could
Okay.
staff each committee.
Thanks.
Is that doable, Chris? Getting 3 people?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just finding the
we
right
weren't really
people,
sure,
I
you
think
know what
is
I
the
mean?
key. Yeah.
We're kind of guessing, but
Yeah.
Well, and
we hope that would be doable for you.
we're hoping that by allowing them to do one or the other, it might make it easier to find volunteers, because the excerpt work is not a ton of pages. On the other hand, the people on the subjective committee get to just read an entire novel, which, it could appeal to different types of
Yeah.
people.
For sure. Thanks.
What's the deadline? When do you want these names?
ASAP.
As soon as possible, we're thinking.
It was September 1.
We talked about a 2 to 3 weeks from now.
Is that okay?
Joe, also, I think that if we have, if we recommend people for the committees and then they don't follow through, like, we would want to know that ASAP so that we can replace them, because we want to get this moving. We don't want these books to be just stagnant with no decisions made because we didn't know we had them bottlenecked. Does that
We
make sense?
appreciate that too. Thank you.
And Chris, we've talked about the backlog of which previously submitted books that we haven't reviewed are we going to. Can you speak to what sort of workload is ready to go on day one, once everyone's trained?
Yeah, we've had a backlog of books for quite some time now because this law has been a moving target, and it's every time we've gotten close, the law has shifted and we've had to regroup and change our processes. With it now being just an excerpt review with 3 quick questions, we should be able to get through that backlog of books fairly quickly, now that we're not asking parents to read the entire book and then get together and talk through all of the nuances there. So we expect that to speed up. We do have over 50 titles that are still kind of pending and backlogged that we want to get decisions made on.
And I would make sure and tell anyone that's participated in the past how it's going to be different, because they might be thinking, well, I did that before and it was a lot of work, and you could come back and say, the law has changed, the process has changed. Does this appeal to you more now that you know that it's the excerpts, for example?
And I would say even if we can get a temporary kind of shot in the arm of help, just a number of parents to help us with that backlog, I think this process will slow down a lot once we make decisions on the backlog books. We have not been receiving large lists of books. We received 2 large lists in the beginning that we've been trying to catch and make decisions on ever since. We don't receive constant submissions. So once we get caught up on the backlog, this should become a pretty minimal time commitment for our committees.
Okay. Anything else from us? I hope we were able to respond to the questions, kind of give you a good broad understanding of how we're not only going to be following through with this process, but how we've tried to fit that process into a policy framework. That policy framework, incidentally, is kind of how we're organizing all of our policies going forward in terms of board policies and memoranda. And those memoranda are more specific to process, where the policies are more specific to the decisions of the board. So if you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to talk to you about it later. But if you don't have any other questions, then thank you very much for allowing us to present. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us at any time. We're happy to respond, okay? Thanks.
Thanks, Doug.
I just want to recognize the years of work that
And
has
Chris
gone
and
into
Joe.
this policy. Thank you very much for all your work. And Chris, for the many hours that you've spent on trying to get this together. We know it's been a huge load, so thank you.
Yeah, I would just I think Superintendent Horsley and others have been great in leading us through that, and our librarians are the ones really doing the tough work out there, and I appreciate all that they've been doing and their patience with our processes and the changing laws, but I appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks, Joe and Chris. We appreciate your work on this. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to our presentation on multi-tiered systems of support and positive behavior interventions and supports. We're going to turn the time over to Scott Bell. Thanks for being here. Just kind of as a setup to this, as he's coming up here, I I requested this just because it's been a while since we've had this review, but also because we spend a significant portion of our budget and schools spend a significant part of their budget on this. As we're reviewing things, we want to make sure that we are spending our money on things that align with our mission and our strategic plan. So I asked them to specifically talk to how this has to do with what this has to do with graduation and getting our kids to the finish line. So we're going to turn it over to Leslie and Scott. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And as mentioned, my name is Scott Bell, and I was here in July, but I'm the Director of College and Career Readiness. And I've been given the opportunity to share with you about multi-tier systems of support and positive behavior intervention systems in our district, or supports in our district. So to give a little background, oftentimes if you Google MTSS or multi-tiered system support, they'll refer to it as a framework. I like to think of that as the lens that we look at through education. So basically that we look at all the things we're doing through that lens of, is this serving tier 1, is it serving tier 2 or tier 3? And the key things with multi-tier system support is that it's the lens that we look at through education to ensure that all students' needs are being met, whether that's on the behavioral side of things or on the academic side of things. And so with that tier 1, our tier 1 instruction, our tier 1 behavioral supports that we have in our schools should meet the needs of, in following the model, 80% of our students. And then the tier 2, and that's some examples of tier 1 would look like our teachers' classroom instruction, the first instruction on a topic or on a lesson. It would also look like our school-wide expectations or classroom structures would all be in that area of tier 1 that all students would get that level of support. Tier 2 is usually for approximately the 15% of students in which those tier 1 supports or tier 1 strategies don't meet those needs to help them be successful, and is usually is typically also framed in the idea that is served in a group format. So for example, if I'm a teacher and I've done a reading intervention, or I've taught some reading and I have some students that aren't up to standard on reading, and I might do a small reading group, that would be a tier 2 intervention. I'm identifying that need, I'm using data to identify that need, and doing a additional support or intervention. Tier 3 is typically for that remaining 5% and is usually at an individual level of intervention to meet the need of that student. One thing that comes into play as we go from tier 2 into tier 3 is our student support teams. In all of our schools, we have what's referred to as SST, or student support teams, to meet. And so for example, if I'm in a grade level team or a PLC and we're identifying some needs of some students or a student, and we've tried some interventions as a team that are in that tier 2 area, and we're not seeing that have the impact that we're striving for to help that student be successful, then that's where we might refer that into our SST, which can include our team of administrators, school counselors, social workers, the teacher, of course, and school psychologists oftentimes are those who are on those teams to help discuss, plan, interventions, put those into practice, and also monitor if they're having the impact that we're striving to have for our students. And so that's some key things you notice on the slide, talking about it being includes data-informed decisions. Panorama is a big factor in that, in which we have the Panorama data, both the social skills and disposition side of things, as well as the attendance, educator's handbook or referral information, as well as academic data that we look at in Panorama is part of that data, or a great source for that. We're using that platform. With positive behavioral intervention and supports, they're positive in nature, as the name implies, that is tied to, and actually PBIS has been around since the late 80s, early 90s. We haven't utilized that in our district that long, but it's been around quite a bit longer than I had realized until I was kind of preparing this. But The key things are behavioral supports that are school-wide and intended to help give some structure, that it's consistency. So for example, if you walk in our schools, here's a few examples that you might see as you go into our schools, that you'll see the posters around that will have usually tied to an acronym tied to the school, for a school pride, for example, or those expectations that are tied usually with an acronym, but also tied to the Graduate of Granite characteristics. Most are using the Graduate of Granite characteristics just in that acronym, as you can see in the examples here. Some may have a different word, but will say what characteristics it ties to. But the important thing is that they do tie to, that they correlate with our Graduate of Granite standards. So that's reinforced, and students are learning those through this process. So for example, if you walk into a school and you might see on the right here, you'll see the Kearns Junior High hallway expectations, so a student knows what those expectations are in that area. And so what does respect look like in a hallway, for example, or communication, or appropriate communication in a hallway, what those expectations are. Also in the classroom, there are PBIS expectations for that classroom, and that doesn't mean that there aren't some differences in classroom expectations from classroom to classroom. You can imagine that an art class would have some different procedures than an English class might, but still there is a level of standardization with the PBIS expectations in a classroom. Also a flow chart of what if a student's struggling, for example, is not following those expectations, there's a flow chart of ways that a teacher can prompt that student and help intervene to help them be successful. My experience has been that's very helpful for multiple ways. One is it's very helpful for students to know what is expected. How should I be behaving, and really helps to teach those expectations and how a student should conduct themselves in a different setting. And also, it helps for our teachers to be able to highlight those expectations and in a way that is not punitive in nature, but more helping them. So for example, if I walk over to a student and say, hey, Scott, I know as you're talking, I need you to get on track. Let's help you get to work. And I can reference that that's the first step on that flow chart. I don't have to be over there and saying, get to work. I can highlight that that's part of the process, prompt, redirect, and get them on task and on track. It also helps foster positive relationships with our teachers, with the students. And also another element that you have probably seen in schools is the token economy is tied also typically to our PBIS and the acronym and the model of PBIS, as students may earn, for example, a PAW at a school or part of their token economy that they can utilize, is also tied to that PBIS model. And that helps both with, and I've seen that model both from an extrinsic standpoint be helpful, that a student has a extrinsic, am I saying that word right? Encouragement but also intrinsically, I think that it helps them in that I found out anyways at some of my schools that the students wanted that card to take home. They were excited to be able to show their parent for that positive praise. They wanted their parents to see they had done well. So I've seen that have kind of an element of encouragement or motivation on both sides of that equation. And so that's tied to, with PBIS, provides clear structure, improves school culture. It helps with some alignment and consistency, which is really important in our schools, and also encourage parent communication. Oftentimes, part of PBIS is contacting parents, giving some positive feedback about their students, as well as I mentioned before, the example of a student wanting to take one of their token economies, show their parents that they had a positive praise. Also, I found for teachers that it's helpful if there's that physical reminder to do positive praise, that it increases that level of positive interaction and relationship building with the students as well. Both MTSS and PBIS tie to our strategic plan, directly tie and are explicitly referenced in the strategic plan, and tie directly to our Graduate of Granite standards to help all students in the accelerated student achievement as referenced on page 5 of the strategic plan. Some examples of that, in each of the 3 focus areas of the strategic plan, academic success, social skills and dispositions, and talent development, I've listed some of the ways in which MTSS and PBIS support that. For example, in academic success, MTSS ensures that looking at what we're doing in our classrooms through that lens of MTSS helps to ensure that all students are being met. I kind of alluded to this before, but a key thing is that we're ensuring that students aren't falling through the cracks. The old school model of I teach it to the kids and hopefully they get it. That's not how we're doing education with our kids in Granite School District. That we ensure that if the way we taught it the first time around or the way we intervened to help teach a behavior didn't work the first time around, how do we help solve that Rubik's Cube for that student to help them be successful in class? Also, PBIS gives a proactive approach to a safe learning environment and school culture to enhance the learning of the students. In social skills and dispositions, the framework for supporting students' behavioral and academic proficiency it also increases healthy relationships, as I've referenced before, and encourages positive relationships with our students, which is paramount for success for students. As well as we do the TFI annually at each school. The TFI is a assessment to gauge how MTS is being, or PBIS is being implemented in each school. And our coaches, we have a team of 4 coaches that help to support each school in their implementation of MTSS and PBIS, and they help proctor that TFI. And it gives valuable data for schools to identify where they are in that process of implementation, identify next steps for growth, and then the coaches also help to support in them reaching that growth that they're striving for. And in talent development, having that structure in the classroom helps to improve classroom behaviors as well as student success in learning. And as a teacher, if I am seeing success in my students, that helps reinforce that I'm doing a good job and want to stay in my profession, as well as if there's structure that increases a safe work environment for employees, and also seeing success in having a more structured environment helps them be more successful as teachers and therefore wanting to stay in their profession. Here are some of the interventions or some of the tiered tools and strategies we're utilizing in schools. You'll notice the green, the ones written in green are tier 1, yellow is tier 2, and red is tier 3. So a few examples. I try to avoid just reading line by line on the slides, but I might on this one a little bit. But I mentioned that the panorama data, that probably could be all 3 colors because we can use that data throughout the whole process. School-wide expectations are certainly apply to all students. Positive reinforcements in classrooms and school-wide. Behavior decision tree, which I referenced before. PBIS teams, every school has a PBIS team that meets regularly and helps coordinate the PBIS efforts in the school. Coaches that I referenced earlier, an MTSS leadership team, school social workers and school counselors. And then the tiered system supports interventions. That could probably also be both yellow and red because that process applies, as well as the SST does as well. But we can also use our district licensed behavioral analysts. So for example, if a school gets to a place where they've tried multiple interventions, they've tried some different strategies, they're finding those things aren't being as successful, we have licensed behavioral analysts or BCBAs that help to support the schools in their interventions and work that they're doing to try to, again, find those interventions and strategies that are going to help that student be successful and support that learning environment. Lastly, the CCR funding sources, I was asked to share some of the different funding sources we use. My department's a little bit unique. I think we have a higher level than normal. We definitely have a higher level than normal of, compared to other departments, of the percentage of funding sources that are outside of the normal WPU or normal staffing funding sources. So a lot of our department is funded through these other funding sources. For example, all of our school counselors, 90% of them are funded through comp guidance funding, which is earmarked by the state specifically for school counselors. When I say 90%, that we do have some that are funded by school-based funds, similar to our social workers. That's why I listed the Title I, Land Trust, and TSSA. We do have some schools that will put in some additional funding to increase their allotment of either social workers or school counselors and that would be school-based decision in coordination with the community council. We also have the school-based mental health qualifying grant that funds a number of our staff, especially our BCBAs and our coaches and social workers. And then the school-based mental health screening grant is another grant that we have that we utilize for positions and funding in our department. So that's kind of a summary of both MTSS and PBIS, as well as our funding sources for our department that might be outside of that normal funding area. And that's my summary of those things. Any questions?
So I'll go ahead and start there. On the slide before this, you have social workers and counselors listed as some of that. I assume those also, some of those supports continue on in the yellow and the red. I know it feels like there's a movement out there to eliminate funding for social workers and counselors in our schools. Can you speak to why is it important, I guess, why do we need to address their mental health? Why do we need to address what's going on with them and how that impacts academic success? Because that's one of our primary concerns.
Mm-hmm. So your question is why it's important to be addressing the emotional needs or the mental health side of things with our students with some of these supports, or specifically with social workers and counselors. One thing I would mention is, remember, the school counselors also follow a comp guidance model that state adopted that of course includes also the future planning, career and college readiness planning side of things. But they also still very much support the mental health supports that are necessary for student success. We have nationally, perhaps internationally, but I don't know that, but nationally we have seen and Utah's no different, we have definitely seen an increased trend of increased mental health need and especially in the area of anxiety among students. And obviously, and I think that, well, I guess I shouldn't say obviously, my response would be, and maybe obvious to me, but that's me speaking for myself, is that if a student is struggling to focus, if we're in a, well, one big thing with anxiety is that fight or flight response, or being in that fight or flight space. If I'm feeling in that place of high anxiety, high stress, kind of in that area of my brain that's much more responsive of a fear response, I'm really not going to be very capable. My abilities to focus in on learning a math equation, for example, is going to be pretty hard for me. So if we're able to help meet students where they are and help them be able to focus and be able to work through some of those emotions or challenges and get them into a place where they are in a mind frame to be able to learn, well, they're going to be able to learn in that area. If you follow Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you've heard that hierarchy of, if I'm in an area where I don't feel safe, which anxiety is very much tied to that safety area, then if I don't have that need met, I can't focus on that next level, which learning would be in a level above that safety area. So I guess my central explanation would be tied to that, of saying, if we're not meeting that need for that student first, they're not going to be able to focus in that classroom to be able to learn and to meet that need. So that's why we want to support them in that area.
Go ahead, Kim.
Actually, I just want to piggyback on that.
Okay, go ahead.
Will you just quickly define, what are the differences between a social worker, a counselor, a behavior analyst? I know we also have psychologists.
Yeah.
Will you just talk about their different jobs?
Yeah, and I'll speak specifically to how we do it in our district, because there might be some differences how other districts might do that. But our school psychologists are through the special ed department, and so they focus on supporting with special ed testing, with supporting our special classes, is a strong emphasis in their responsibilities. They still, and when I say that, it doesn't mean that they don't still support other needs in their schools, but that's their primary needs. Our social workers, they are more tied to they're licensed social workers, so they're able to be, they're licensed mental health workers, so they're able to meet those, are focused in those mental health needs. So they serve on our SST and help with problem solving or for intervention planning with those. They also run small groups. They also can do individual support, individual counseling with students to help them. Of course, that requires parent permission. Anytime a school counselor or social worker meets with a student on an ongoing basis, that requires parent permission and coordination with the parent to do so. But those are some of the key things that they do. Now, I mentioned earlier that both counselors and social workers are listed on here in green, but could be in all three of those areas, because also our social workers will oftentimes do things that are school-wide. For example, they might do social skills and dispositions lessons in classrooms, and that's going to be to all students to teach them some basic skills that all students can benefit from in how to make friends, how to interact with other students, or things of that nature. They support those endeavors as well. Where a school counselor follows this specific, and we have social workers and school psychologists in all three levels of education. We have school counselors only in the secondary level, so junior high and high school. And they also serve on the SST. They follow a comp guidance model, which includes career exploration-focused lessons in all grades, including from 6th grade to 12th grade if they're in the middle school, and career planning in addition to those needs of, because they still will meet with students if there's some mental health needs or some ways that they're helping to support the students from an emotional stability standpoint, but they don't do any kind of ongoing therapy or something like that.
So who does give therapy?
If it's ongoing therapy, we typically refer that out, but short-term or helping in, so I'm trying to use that word carefully, but because if it's ongoing, we're trying to find other resources outside of the school. But a social worker in our school would be licensed to do so, and they do in a short-term way, but not ongoing or long-term.
With parent approval?
Of course, yes. Again,
And
even if a school counselor is meeting with a student in any kind of ongoing basis, they need to have parent permission.
I think that one of the things that I've seen is that the word therapy has, I think you're right to be careful using that word because it has so many implications.
Right.
And one of the things that is being discussed are some of these things in green therapy? And our teachers giving therapy in group settings, like, is this group therapy when we all get together and discuss our favorite holiday or whatever it is?
Right.
And so can you just speak to that for a minute?
Happy to. So thank you for asking that question.
And if I can just give more color to that, I think the question is, what's the difference between social emotional learning or PBIS and therapy?
Okay.
Because I think those terms are being conflated in some ways.
And I would say social emotional learning is not PBIS. PBIS is that structure in which the school is trying to teach expectations, help students follow expectations, have structure to be successful, where when we talk about social emotional learning, or as in our district we call social skills and dispositions, that's more tied to teaching skills to help skills, and that can include skills in emotional intelligence, decision-making skills, friendship-making skills, how to understand our emotions. If I'm getting angry, how do I cope with that emotion? So more in that area is what I would say is in that area of social emotional or social skills and dispositions.
So you'd say graduate of Granite, or I'm sorry, the social skills and dispositions, you would not say are a part of PBIS.
I would not say they're not part of PBS. I'm saying they're not the same thing.
Yeah, because they are in the structure.
Right.
There.
So they're definitely tied to each other. I'm not meaning to say they're not.
Yeah.
I'm just saying they're not the exact same thing. But to your other part of your question, though, about the idea of, hey, where is therapy and what isn't therapy? And I appreciate you bringing that up because that is a sensitive and touchy topic. And so what I would say to that is that when we're talking about, so for example, if a social worker is doing a group, typically what a group is going to look like is going to be tied to social skills like how to build friendships. We might run a group for grieving if we have a group of students that have lost a loved one or a parent recently or something to that effect. Support of that, and again, is more tied to skill building, and that might be a key component. Is more skill building focused is a key component. As far as the classrooms, when I mentioned that there's social skills and dispositions lessons or social emotional lessons, those are much more tied to a tied curriculum that they're utilizing that is much more tied to those age-appropriate social skills or skill building that's helpful with coping, understanding what's going on if I'm angry, helping them manage stress, or helping them some of those type of topics, not deep, psychological therapy, I guess is one word. The word that I'm searching for is escaping me.
Okay, Clark, can Doug use your microphone?
I'd be honored.
So I often have to train the counselors, social workers, and psychs on this issue because we are precluded actually from giving what we consider to be clinical therapy, right? We don't get into the clinical areas of diagnosing or of treating certain diagnosable affirmities, mental illnesses, that sort of thing that you find in the DSM-5. And so what do we do is exactly what Scott was talking about, is we build skills to help students to be successful in school. That's our role. It's not to do clinical therapy, it's to help kids build skill sets so that they can be successful in school. That's how we differentiate the two. That's how we keep ourselves from being getting in trouble with Medicaid and Medicare, and there are a lot of implications there. So that's why we stay out of the clinical side, and we work on the social skills and dispositions that help kids to be successful.
Yeah.
And do we
Thanks, Doug.
train our teachers to know where the line is between I'm teaching and I'm mentoring a child, and now I need to pass. Do they know where that line is all the time? Because we know our teachers love their kids, right?
So actually, there are some policies specifically related to this issue, and these have been taken care of, or these have been addressed. These go all the way back to, the state FERPA rule that I've talked about in this setting before. And that is that there are certain areas that we don't address with kids related to their psychological elements, their politics, et cetera, et cetera. We talk frequently to teachers about avoiding certain subjects without parental permission, not providing or not trying to acquire, not giving surveys to kids to try to acquire some, information about those subjects, and one of those things that we talk about is just maintaining that level of professionalism. So in state law, also in their educator standards, R277217, it also addresses some of these issues, what the boundaries are between a professional relationship with a student and an unprofessional relationship with a student. So yes, I would say that we frequently discuss these issues. It's not maybe addressed in, the way I just described it with respect to therapy, but we often speak about what is an appropriate and professional relationship with students.
I think one example I might bring up is when I was here in July and spoke about the trauma-informed practices that we did at the start of the school year for teachers. That was explicitly explained there too, where that line is, as well as, so that was actually taught in that setting recently at the start of the school year. And as well, vector training. Yeah, the annual training.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that in my experience, we don't really participate in therapy. We teach kids skills. Therapy is what we kind of say, hey, parent, you should probably take your kid if need be. Having said that, if a kid's in crisis, we're going to intervene. So the day after a death at the school, we have a crisis team there, and they might be working with kids quite a bit, but I wouldn't even call that day therapy. It's crisis intervention, and we're trying to help the kid speedily get back to the learning process. That's all we're about. Trying to help the kid be in a better spot so that they can go back and participate in learning and build up their skill set so that they can better participate in learning. PBIS, MTSS is all about meeting the kid where they're at and ensuring that they can be successful in the teaching and learning process.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, tying it definitely is to help them be successful in learning.
And I think that what you just said, Mitch, is I think legislators need to know that. I think they don't know that. I think they don't understand it on that level. And I would love to see our district be proactive about this, what Nicole was saying, this sense of like, God, we need to defund, social workers and counselors. by making sure that they understand what role they're playing and what role they're not playing in our schools, because I think it's confused. And I think that if they understood what they were really doing, they would be in support of it. But I think that there's this sense out there from the discussion that I've had with people that something else is going on. And so I would love for our district to be proactive about sending that message before the session starts in some way. And maybe we can discuss ways that I can support and help do that. But I think it's very important. And I've had discussions with board members from other districts who are starting to say the same thing. We better get proactive about this and make sure that these misunderstandings do not continue before it hurts kids, in ways that it wasn't meant to hurt them.
I would just make mention of that. I don't disagree with what you said, and I want to indicate that as appropriate, we have had conversations, even since the last legislative session on this topic. There's a book that's out there. There's these conversations that are happening. I would say, though, to the degree that we see this issue among our legislative representatives is much more minimal than it is in other places. So I continue to have conversations with people like...
We're friends with other representatives.
Yes. So with like Representative Elison, who has an in-depth understanding of this process and what the intent of social workers in schools really is. And is to what Mitch indicated, it's to help facilitate the learning process and help build skills in kids. Clinical therapy is not our job.
If I may, there's another layer to all of this too, and the younger you go, the more this is relevant, is a lot of our students come that are hungry or cold or wet. And so our social workers honestly are key and vital into getting the connections for the services they need. If they're hungry, they get snack packs from the foundation. There's also like underclothing and socks and all different kinds of things you can get from the foundation so that you can get them ready to learn.
I would like to circle back just briefly on the also the parent involvement, because that's a key component as well. As I've mentioned multiple times how if it's ongoing, but also if, as a school counselor, if I have a student come into my office and I'm visiting with them, I involve parents in that process, because again, if my student's speaking with someone and missing some class, I want to know that or be involved in that process. So parents are involved throughout the process of somebody meeting with them, because that's, and it's also an important teammate to make in that process of helping the student.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of comments. I think, first of all, the reason you asked for this presentation is specific to like connecting it to our graduate of Granite and that. And so these questions are not specific to that. I appreciate the work that's been put in on that side. I want to focus more on PBIS specifically, and I think direct these questions this direction, because we talked about this 1.5 years ago. I think at that time, we had discussed like whether there was any data that we can evaluate, whether this is really an effective program. I shared concerns I had at that time, which I still have. PBIS specifically, I feel like has the potential to do harm, frankly, in the sense that it can skew a kid's worldview. I mean, we all know we don't walk around in the real world expecting prizes every time we do something good. We do something good because it's the right thing to do. And I feel like PBIS takes away from teaching students to do things that are right because they are right. They learn to expect a reward or do something for a reward, and there's no intrinsic value gained there. I feel like the changes we see are probably more than likely temporary changes because it's not an intrinsic change that's happening. We're changing behavior to gain an external reward. If students don't value the reward, what do you have? Nothing. I've been in classes where I've seen the PBIS happening. I've seen cases where students respond. I've seen cases where they respond and 60 seconds later they're back doing what they were before. Then we have to redo it. 60 seconds later, they're back doing, not listening to the teacher again. And I've seen cases where nobody cares. Don't listen at all, but we're still trying that same model over and over. I have serious concerns about it not actually being something that, to put it frankly, is ultimately good for society in the long term. We're not helping kids learn what's right for the sake of it being right. Does that make sense? So I would like to hear still, I don't think I've heard anything in the year and a half since we talked about this, like what do we have that actually is solid data that says this is actually effective intrinsically to students, and how can we gather that data? Maybe it's really hard to get. I'm sure it is really hard to get, but the studies that I've seen don't show this as being an effective, long-term and internalized way to create change.
I think I try to respond to that in a simple way. I think we'd be happy to try and collate some data and some additional information if that's what the board would like us to do. The thing that I think is most important here is that we're trying to get good outcomes in terms of academics from our kids. There are certain responsibilities that fall within the home and the family to teach values and doing right for the right thing. We do teach character in our schools, and that's important. Some of our kids do not get that in their homes, and helping them understand appropriate behaviors in the classroom space invariably is intended to help improve academic outcomes. So I do feel like we could probably correspond quality PBIS programs with better academic outcomes. But I'd have to look to our experts to determine that. I know for a fact that we can demonstrate poor PBIS implementation and show that we're not really getting quality Tier 1 instruction. I've been in schools this year and had that conversation with principals and with SLIDs. And so I recognize and understand your point and your concern. I do feel like we could validate good instructional quality and tie that to better student outcomes with good best practices in terms of PBIS. But if that's what the board would like us to research, I think we could probably put something together. Do you want to add to that, Scott or Mitch?
Am I understanding the key crux of what you're asking, am I understanding right, is the concern that rewarding students, so specifically the token economy side of things, being more extrinsic and not motivated by themselves to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do? Is that kind of the crux of what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Getting down to that, getting something every time, expecting to get something or hoping to get something, some kind of reward because they did something right,
And if I may, one thing I would highlight about that is to keep in mind that PBIS, the reward system or the token economy is one component of PBIS, not the meat of PBIS. I would contend that the main thing about PBIS is the consistent structure that it provides, the consistent expectations that it provides school-wide and in the different settings that help teach those expectations of, hey, so for example, the way I behave in a classroom is different than the way I behave in a cafeteria. And understanding what those behaviors are and helping to teach that and when things are appropriate in different settings is a big part of that. And having that consistent of, hey, we have these rules that we expect, that are rules/expectations that we utilize in those settings. I would argue that's the bigger part of PBIS, is that consistency it gives in the messaging. And so that would be the first thing I'd mention. But the second thing is I agree wholeheartedly the importance of being intrinsically motivated, that we want to do the right things tied to character, tied to a desire to do a good job, tied to feeling good about ourselves. Those things are super important. I would say that I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I would also suggest that being able to have a balance of some extrinsic encouragement, especially from a standpoint of, as a teacher, when I go out to lunchroom when I was a principal, for example, if I had some of those we call them pause at Kearns Junior, for example, that when I had those with me, it was a reminder for me to praise kids for doing good things. And one of the one measure of strategies that are effective in helping to improve behavior or help students with behavior is attention. Unfortunately, research shows whether it's negative or positive, it will have an effect size. So having that reminder to do that positive relationship with a student of saying, hey, I want to tell that student they did a great job, it did help me remember to do that relationship side of things, which I think was a positive piece. But I also think that intrinsic or internal, as well as those extrinsic rewards, can work complementary of one another. And I think we're striving to do that.
I just want to piggyback on that. I know there's plenty of research that does show, and I hadn't thought about it until you brought this up, Scott, but one thing that we've worked on as a faculty where I teach is building relationships with students, because the evidence is very clear. If you do not have a good relationship with the students, they will not learn from you. It's very, very difficult to have that happen. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because I hadn't thought about it that way. But there is some very solid research on that, but it is a reminder for me, okay, I need to have that relationship with this kid, be able to build that. And there are many ways that we do that. We've talked about, I think even as a board, it's been brought up that, having that 10 contacts in 10 days, is that what it is? The 10 that?
Oh, the 2 and 10?
Yeah, the 2 and 10, thank you. Anyway, that where you have a positive interaction outside of what you're teaching with that kid, but that really does have, and there is some solid evidence on that, so I think that is a very relative.
When you said it, Nicole, it reminded me also that it did help is helping us teacher also, or educators, us in general, be positive. The adage of that which we feed grows. So if I'm looking for those things to say, hey, good job, I appreciate that you did this, or I saw you work really hard at that. If I'm looking for those things, I'm going to see those a lot more. And if I'm looking for who's messing up or not doing what they should be doing, I'm going to see that more. So it did help also with that positive piece as a educator too.
I think it's important as well is obviously they might get a token, and maybe their token isn't a sucker. Maybe it's being line leader the next day or something like that. So some of these rewards aren't necessarily something to put in your pocket. It can be an extra special assignment or whatnot. But I think the bigger thing too is to remember as kids are having these little interactions that behavior is being discussed. And we can't overlook that too in the PBIS, is it's not just come here, get this, go back to class. Whoever's interacting with that kid, that student is, my hope would be, that they're talking about behavior. Why was the behavior inappropriate in the first place? How can we fix that? What could be a different behavior? What's a different way to respond? And principals, I've seen this, some of our outstanding principals, they can have these conversations in about 2 minutes and that kid's back in class, right? Even if he or she were just belligerent before, or whatever. So I think in the PBIS, as we're looking for that good behavior, I always say you find what you look for, right? And so I think we can't overlook that there are behavior lessons all over the place throughout this PBIS process.
I love that, Karen. And I think also to say that we don't live in a society that rewards us for our behaviors, we do in jobs. We're teaching these kids, if you are on time to school, if you are, doing what you're supposed to, if you're a hard worker, if you're doing that, you can get a promotion at work, or you can. I think that is intrinsically built into our society, and you do get a reward in that way. So to say that it doesn't happen that way, yes, I would hope that my child behaves regardless of whether they get a sucker or not. I hope I've taught them that. But I think there are certain things that it does still also reinforce that when you do the things that, these characteristics of Granite, a graduate of Granite, that is something that can lead to other things, not just a sucker or whatever. But
I also wanted to add that most of our world religions are really built on rewards and punishments. It's a real part of our culture, right?
I just want to clarify that when my son does a crappy job mowing the lawn, right, there's a PBIS built into that, right? It's part of our culture, right? And when I explain to him that if he doesn't do a good job in the future, nobody's going to want to hire him and have a job, right? And so then I show him how he can improve on that process and procedure, and then sometimes he does a better job, and then I try to provide positive reinforcement to his effort there, right? I'm not doing anything different. I think sometimes we maybe overthink these things a little bit too much, but I would hope the intent and the understanding is just, hey, we're trying to inspire and incentivize appropriately positive behavior so kids can learn. at the end of the day. That's what the meat and the thrust of PBIS is. And I would assert that there is plenty of data that we could show that we could share, and we're happy to collate that at the board's request to show the impacts of quality PBIS in our schools, both within our schools and nationally speaking.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, when you brought that up, it made me bristle, and so I just want to make sure we clarify that. To me, it's not an either or. I'm inspired by the phrase, there's tyranny of or and the genius of and. And the genius of and here is that if you're just doing the token economy, you're probably not doing PBIS. You're doing some version that you're calling PBIS, and it's probably not very good. But if you have really good instruction and it is inspired by positive behavior supports, meaning I'm not yelling at you because you're not paying attention. Instead, I'm saying, Susie, thank you so much for paying attention. Johnny, I really appreciate you paying attention. All of a sudden, I've recognized positive behaviors, and the student that needs to pay attention decides, hey, I want to get that praise too. They start behaving, coupled with, now we can actually learn, and learning happens, and magic in terms of teaching and learning happens. Now PBIS is effective, and you can't separate the two. We certainly aren't going to get good behavior, at least to the level we want, by just doing punishments. And that negative reinforcement isn't going to produce good outcomes either. It has to be a combination of all of these things. And I think most importantly, it's coupled with teaching and learning. If we go into a classroom, and I'm sure we could all do this, and we see somebody doing PBIS without good instruction, we're going to be like, that doesn't work. And we see no PBIS and bad instruction, that doesn't work. But if we have good instruction and PBIS, I think that we're going to see magic happen.
But you're saying the word punishment, and we do have punishment, but we call it consequences and accountability. Would you agree?
That's what I'm saying.
Which we aren't really emphasizing here.
And we're not saying that goes away.
But it's a part of it.
It's absolutely a positive, or part of it. But if you only lead with that, you've been in that classroom where the teacher just yells at the kids for not doing what they're supposed to do, and it's miserable.
I've led that classroom.
I got to tell you, this is something I'm trying to learn and develop a better skill with respect to. And it's different for elementary kids than it is for high school students, right? Me pouring on praise to my students is a little bit different than what we see. We were just at a classroom at a school site visit last week, and the teacher was, these kids cleaned up their desks and did their transition in like 30 seconds. And the teacher's like, Stacy, you're doing such a great job. And you can see this other kid's like, are you seeing me? I'm awesome too, right? And it was just built into this quality instructional environment, right? But then conversely, we've been in other classrooms where it is, I don't want kids to do things because they fear, right? I don't want to do that in my home, although it's very effective there as well.
I would contend that junior high and high school kids still love that.
Yeah.
But I think that what Kim asked is a very interesting question, and that is, can we get data to show it?
And I think that's a fair question.
I
Kim,
do
and
too,
I think we should.
but also another fair question is, can it be measured? I mean, what data are you going to get that's going to really give you an accurate picture that you know it's real? I don't know if that exists.
I'm wondering if we can have data, just kind of thinking about your question, even if we just put it on, start out with a teacher survey, end of year, because we do end of year, don't we do end of year teacher surveys? Do we not do that? Like, maybe not. Just, I'm just thinking how, rate how well do you implement the PBIS interventions and supports in your own classroom? And then that would give us at least a starting point of where, and how well is it implemented in the school? Just at least that would give us a baseline of, okay, maybe this school is not doing it, and then we can kind of look at that and, okay, well, do we see increased behavior problems? Do we see increased,
Yes, so I would, go ahead.
I just came from being the principal at a school that I would argue is the penultimate PBIS school in secondary. The RISE program that it drives what happens at Skyline. RISE stands for Resilience, Integrity, Support, and Excellence. And the behaviors that are taught through that and then reinforced. We have a really small token economy, but mostly it's recognizing, hey, you're doing a great job. It couples with the 4-to-1 praise ratio and all the other good aspects of teaching. It's the #1 public education system in Utah, and I think part of it is its PBIS.
I would say anecdotally, we do measure this. We have what's called a positive school culture rubric that we have our school leadership teams fill out as part of our site visit. Then in the spring, when we go back for an additional site visit, we have them fill it out again as an entire school staff so that we can kind of measure what the school leadership team thinks. And there's a couple questions related directly to PBIS and behaviors within that rubric. So to your point, I guess we do, in fact, and that's part of our conversations in our site visit is as we go through that rubric and identify what are some of the challenges. We don't pull all that data from every school and stick it into a spreadsheet and then balance that off of student outcomes or testing data. But what it does show is what we are currently using that format and that data for is for them to self-reflect as a school on what improvements they could make as part of their school improvement plan. And so, and again, usually we're tying positive behaviors to improving quality instruction and having better outcomes.
My team could, one place we could start is my team could work on some data sources and maybe share them with the ELT and see if that's beneficial or helpful.
I think that would be great. We did something comparable on cell phone data. We put just a spreadsheet together with a number of research and data supports. I think would the board appreciate something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, you know, the question that I was going to ask about this presentation, Scott, is, I mean, as long as I've been on the board, and I mean, as long as I've had kids in Granite, PBIS has been our structure for behavior in schools. And we're hearing more and more that behavior is becoming more and more of an obstacle. And so my question to you is, what are we going to do differently? Are we doing things differently, or are we just more of the same? Because I haven't seen any seeming evidence or discussion that there has been improvement, but I haven't also heard any conversation about changing what we're doing. And you know how it is with, you know, when we have our, when our teachers get together to have their discussions in grade levels or teams. Thank you. PLCs. When they have PLCs, they get together and they say, where are we? Where are our gaps? And then they figure out how to reteach it differently. Not the same, but differently, right? Are we doing that here with behavior? Are we figuring out what's not getting through, or are we just saying it again and again and again?
Yeah.
In the same old ways?
And I do think that the answer to this question is broader than my area of responsibility, but speaking in the umbrella of college career readiness, well, this might be a little broader too. But we talked how there has been an emphasis on increasing the skills of our teachers in that tier 1 level of instruction. I think that's been something that we continue to work on in our district or district-wide to help give more tools to our teachers is one thing. Our BCBAs, that's actually only been, our BCBAs have been for 2 years, or well, no, 3 years about, right? Our BCBAs are in our district. The regular ed, we've had BCBAs longer in special ed, but our general ed to support schools with some of those more challenging behavioral concerns is an additional resource that's fairly new in our district. So those are a couple that I could think of right off to answer your question of some ways that we're trying to support that. And some things I think are slow boulders that grow over time. And so when you're talking about a complex, large system like our district is, but when we've been talking about behavioral and addressing behavior things, I think one thing that's been certainly changing for over time in a positive direction is, we use the term when we were talking about, what's the word we were using? Punishment. Much more of a focus on, hey, when we are changing behavior, much less emphasis on punishment, a much increased focus on learning. If you don't know how to read, if a student doesn't know how to read, we teach them how to read. So when we're teaching them, if they don't know how to behave, how are we teaching them? Now, does that include consequences? Sure. But those consequences with an emphasis on how are we helping them learn through that process. John, were you going to?
Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, I don't know, can you hear my mic here? I was just going to say, working with my directors, and I could just think off the top of my head, some elementary schools and some secondary schools where we had behaviors that were really prevalent, creating problems, and some schools that then made a concentrated effort to do a better job of implementing PBIS, where we could pull the data and show you there's a stark difference when in Educator's Handbook. I mean, that's one of the things that we track it with. On a school schools that have made an effort to do what it is we've been teaching, and how much the behaviors have improved. And so I can work with Scott and have my directors work with him. We could probably pull some data that might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that my question comes on the tail of Kim's, because Kim's saying, let's look at data to see if this is effective. And I think that we can also use that data to say, are we improving?
Yeah.
And what kind of impact is what we're doing working?
From a behavioral standpoint.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm talking about from a behavioral standpoint, especially since this is the #1 complaint we're getting from teachers and frustration about their jobs. And we want our kids to learn, and B, our teachers to be happy both. So
Yeah.
if this is that important, we should be measuring it and looking at it that way.
Yeah.
Does that address your desire, Kim? Is there anything more specific that you'd like than what has been suggested to gather that data?
No, that sounds great, thank you, and I appreciate your addition on the end there, Julie, because yes, measuring whether the behavior is actually improving is whether, to me, would show if PBIS works, right?
Did you have any additional questions? I thought you said you had more than one. Or
No, I
comments.
kind of covered some of my concerns in my little monologue, so I'm good.
Okay. Is there any, Connie?
Yeah, I can't imagine that PBIS doesn't go along with what Aaron Wilson and what they're doing. To me, that's all combined, because just like John said, those that are incorporating PBIS is going to have a better learning. So if we can learn from those schools type thing, surely that's something that we can help the rest of the schools even come with. I don't know if that's possible, but in my mind, they go together somehow.
Okay, so it sounds like we have some direction given, that we'd like some more data and research, and Julie has one more comment.
On the last slide, can you move to the last slide? We've got these funding sources. Those top 3, I guess my question is, based on those top 3, do we have a higher instance of counselors and social workers than other districts across the state, or is this funding also given across the state?
So the funding sources, as far as comp guidance, that's given by the state, and that's done in a similar formula as we have our WPU. So that would be pretty standard across the state.
Okay.
Yeah, as far as the 2 grants, they're available to all districts, but I don't know if all districts have them and at what rate they're allotted versus others.
So we get our counselors and social workers based on a, quote, WPU that is really called Utah State Comprehensive Guidance. It's
School
not-
counselors, not social workers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the comprehensive counseling, the model, that comp guidance model is specifically the school counselors model that they use statewide
And
for their
so-
practice.
Funding for social workers, where does that come from?
In large part, the school-based mental health grant funds quite a number of those. We have a few other sources. But also, one thing I'd highlight is when ESSER was going away last year, as I came into my role, so at this time last year, one of my biggest stressors was that we had 19 social workers hired through on ESSER funding that was going away. And, when you're talking about 19 people's jobs, that's a big weight that we're trying to figure out. But I will say that as we looked at some solutions and as we met with principals and talked about what they're valuing and their budgets, we have, I couldn't speak to exactly how many right here, but we had a strong number of schools that wanted to use school-level funds to support their social workers because they see the value in their work in helping in their school culture and meeting their needs of some of their most challenging students as well. So both at a macro level, like the whole school level, but also at the level of a more small group support too. So the schools were seeing a lot of value in the work they were, or the benefits they were seeing with their social workers.
And Todd, are we using some of our unrestricted funds to support social workers? And I remember also that some of our one-time funds that we used this year, so we didn't have to raise taxes, I think they were going to literacy coaches, not social workers. Am I right?
So both the literacy coaches and the social workers were funded with ongoing dollars. Those are not the one-time funding positions.
Okay.
So there is district dollars helping to support as well.
Okay. But there's nothing that the legislature that gives that says this money should go to social workers or this money should go to counselors, the Utah State Comprehensive Guidance,
Yes.
right? But they don't give specific money for social workers.
There is not a WPU-driven allocation of funds to that end.
That's just at the discretion of
categorical
the
funding
LEA.
through grants.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. We have need of an executive session for the purpose of litigation. And so I will entertain a motion as such.
I move that we go to executive session for the purpose of litigation.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to move to executive session for the purpose of litigation. This is a roll call vote. Please state your name and your vote. Connie, go ahead and go first.
Connie Burgess. What else do you need?
Vote yes.
Oh, yes.
Kim Chandler, yes.
Julie Jackson, yes.
Chris Wynn, yes.
Karen Winder, yes.
Clark Nelson, yes.
And Nicole McDermott, yes. All right, we'll take a 5-minute intermission while we invite, who's going to stay? Is Doug? All of ELT will stay. Okay, we're going to take a real quick 5